or as we say, greetings, agents of impact. Thank you, Isaac. Zulema, our colleague, usually kicks these things off, but she's off today, so it falls on me to say the call is being recorded. I think you heard that. So, and there is a chat line. I see some folks are already jumping in and introducing yourself. That's kind of become a tradition. But do say, yeah, where you're, what, organization, but also like where geographically. It's always great to see the spread of folks across the country, across the world. I'm very gratified that so many folks showed up for a municipal bond market call just a few days before the holidays and whatnot. So I think it was David Sands at CCM on one of these earlier calls, Lourdes, and everybody said that we had sort of assembled the Muni nerds. And I hope you're all proud to be Muni nerds. We've become something of Muni nerds too. Um, Let me. I guess one more piece of housekeeping. Not in addition to the chat, there's a Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I think sometimes it hides out under the More button. And if you want to drop questions in, we'll try to work them into the flow here. So you can obviously ask questions or have chat, conversation in the chat as well. But if you really want to put a specific question to the panel, I think the Q&A will be best. Let me bring in first my colleague Dennis Price, who has been working this Muni beat for a few years as part of our partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, David. Great to be back.
Dennis also, folks probably know, is the CEO of Impact Alpha. So he's kind of moonlighting back on the sort of editorial side of things here. But he's been digging in and has become something of a Muni nerd, I think, Dennis, right?
I think I qualify now. Um, but David, quietly at some level, we've seen a record year of bond issuances as cities and states, universities, nonprofits saw something north of 500 billion projected by the end of the year in capital for things like roads, bridges, sewers. For municipalities, it's low cost capital for a public purpose. Some call it the original impact investment.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. And this surge, I want to ask our guests later, what to make of that, of issuances. But I think what we're going to dig into is not all cities and states and areas have the same kind of access, right?
No, I think that's right. Record numbers, record amounts of issuance, but some, rural cities, smaller cities, rural areas have, perceived risks among investors. Sometimes that lack of track record or sort of top tier credit rating either, boxes them out of the market or raises their cost of capital. So we're excited with this, our guest today to dig in on some, dare we say, innovation in the muni bond market that's addressing some of that.
Terrific. Stick around and help me steer the conversation here. But let's bring in the guest and let's just say hello for starters. Lourdes Germán of the Public Finance Initiative. Welcome back. You're a veteran of calls and lots of partnership with Impact Alpha. So thank you.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Michael Gaughan of the Vermont Bond Bank. Welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Real honor.
Where are you coming in from, Michael?
In Burlington, Vermont here. I can assure you that the rest of Vermont does not look like the large construction project outside my window here, but you will see some exciting housing development underway during the
I
course of
was
this
I was
meeting.
saying usually people have the stereotype of maple trees out there in the especially this time of year, but you've got a crane, I think, and some
Yeah, we had a crane, some concrete being poured on a new parking deck. So yeah, quite
aw-
exciting. Not your typical scene of Vermont.
awesome. And Damon Burns from Finance New Orleans, also a veteran of these one of these agents of impact calls. Welcome back, Damon.
Good afternoon, David. Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Presumably you're coming to us from New Orleans.
The one and only. Happy to
Great.
be here.
And then Eric Glass of Clarion Call Capital. Again, I think welcome back, Eric. And we talked about munis with you way back on a podcast uh, at least 7 or 8 years ago. So we've been tracking with you on this topic. So welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
And then finally, Brian Boland of the Delta Fund. And Brian, welcome to the Agents of Impact call.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Brian, where are you physically, geographically located?
Just outside of Seattle, Washington, where it's been a little wet lately, and as you've tracked our floods, we're luckily unimpacted. But things are pretty interesting up here.
Yeah, we've been hearing about that, so that's on point. Okay, Lourdes, maybe help kick us off. I guess theme one is uh, how bond markets broadly can contribute to health and prosperity for all residents, as we were saying, and then more specifically, how capital from different sources, public finance, philanthropic dollars, impact investments can sort of work together to make the gears work a little better. So tell us about public finance initiatives work and particularly with the smaller cities and rural areas we've been talking about.
Sure. And again, such a pleasure to be here. And I already love the questions in the chat that I'm seeing because they're really going to hit on things that we're talking about and trying out that in my history working in capital markets, I have not seen, which is what makes our work exciting and also difficult. But at the Public Finance Initiative, we're a nonprofit that focuses on really working with what we call the cohort of the willing, those who see that there's a place for a values-based conversation and care and concern for community and outcomes when we make financial decisions. And we work with local governments and states across the country and even globally, and have worked across now, I think, over 47 states and with over 480 governments and counting, including some that are on this call. And part of what we think about every day is where are the market failures and how can we address that by thinking about the stakeholders who already play meaningful roles at the table, including some that I see in Arthur's question and others, and where there's room for innovation. And let me start with first sharing that everything that I'm about to describe, I share credit with our entire team, including our Director of Rural and Small Cities. But I'm going to paint you guys a picture, and I want you to think, what would this community do if there's a small or mid-sized rural community in Seattle or some parts of Washington or Vermont, and that community is constrained because they've lost federal aid that they predicted and all of a sudden is gone or different. They are facing constraints in their tax base. So every year they're trying to balance the budget in accordance with what the Constitution or other statutes may require. And then they have an unexpected shock where you've got a massive flood and something that we know is not just going to take 3 months, 2 months, a year to fix, but it's going to have impacts that are multi-year because it not only impacts the way that that government operates, but it requires significant capital investment. If that community isn't able to draw from their own fiscal base, i.e. the money that they raise and their public finances to solve that, and they can't look to outside investors who already see a profile of risk that has gotten worse, where is that money going to come from? Can they go to the philanthropic community with a list and say, hey, here, this huge unexpected thing that has possibly a multi-generational aspect to it, help us solve for that? We think that everybody should have access to capital and that there should be avenues to consider how to provide that on the most capital efficient terms. And beyond technology solutions that say, hey, here's how you reach people, tell people about your public finances and share information. What we're testing in this program is something a little bit different that the market hasn't seen. It's considering whether and how foundations, who specifically we know are philanthropic entities and can show up and make transformational grants across the country and across the world, can show up as social investors differently, using a tool that's been around for a really long time and that predates our work called the program-related investment, and considering the power of that investment if it's structured as a guarantee. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, think about if that foundation could serve with their guarantee a credit enhancement purpose, where right now you as a community have to convince investors that you're bankable, that you're going to be able to pay them back. And not only that, but also actually not just default on the debt, but maintain some measure of fiscal health so that you're paying for everything else that government and residents require of you. And the theory of change of this program is, can a guarantee be a meaningful tool when it comes from a philanthropy that believes in your mission, that believes in healthy communities, and that also can provide a credit enhancement that is currently not available on the open market, in that, for example, it could bring your credit rating to a AAA at a moment when if you look under the hood, are facing significant fiscal weaknesses. And I can dig in a little bit more into that.
Well, that's what I said. Let's just unpack that a little bit to make sure people are tracking along. So, public finance initiative is working with issuers in states and cities and other agencies that have access to the bond market through their statutory authority and that sort of thing. But you're saying you're solving some sort of financing problems to be able to bring their credit ratings up to a level that will give them better cost of capital when they go to the market. Is that the short of it? And maybe give us an example of a kind of structure that where this might work, or an actual place.
Sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head on so many important aspects of this, and there's a couple others that I'll clarify. So when I'm talking about that model community that hopefully you're holding in your mind and heart, often we know that even before that disaster, they don't go to market on their own. It can be expensive, it can be hard. They might have a lot of other conditions that don't make that the best and capital efficient process, even like on its own on a good day. And we recognized early on in this program, when we had the opportunity to recruit, that state and county rural serving organizations and also quasi-governmental organizations that, if you think about the hierarchy of government, would sit like at the top of multiple cities, multiple localities, unincorporated areas, are in an extremely powerful position to move the needle towards change for several reasons. One, because often where they have the ability to be the market participant, they have a profile that is recognized in the market as a state entity that is strong and has experience, and also a history with municipal finance products, including bonds and notes, that is well documented, and where they run loan funds or have the desire to create new products that could loan low interest loans or loans with forgiveness and subsidies to those smaller communities. That can actually be the best and most powerful market entry point for many small and rural governments than them going at it alone. And we thought, well, what if we elevated their power in the market, their ability to command a great price by introducing the opportunity with their the sophistication that often exists also within these entities, to couple the guarantee, like if you were unlayering an onion. It's an example that we just talked about with one of our participants. Like, what if you have all these different ways to show the market that you have credit enhancement even on your own, but having a guarantee plug in right where you need it could actually help you not just price a deal better, sell it at a more capital efficient terms, and then guess what you can do? Pass on those savings, the subsidies, to maybe a wider number of communities, unrated communities, communities that really need it, and just expand not just your fiscal base, but the ability to contribute to theirs. And then we recognize the last point that I'll end on is we know that just having money there doesn't mean that people know how to use it, that they're pipelines, and that the conditions that also could inhibit that small community are solved for. So what our program also does with the sites that we're working with is say, well, what if on the top we bring the resources to this state or county or quasi-governmental entity, and then we work with them to say, what's your biggest challenge in terms of like the context and what's happening locally, for those communities to come to the table, to use the resource, for those in your ecosystem who need investment. And then we create an educational program that is very bespoke to solve for that, and to basically say what practices need to shift either that you desire for this context, so that when money lands, it's actually used and can have this intergenerational character of change.
Again, let's just take those one at a time. So from the point of view of the guarantee, just to be clear, this is a philanthropic entity, a foundation or what have you, and they're going to put down some kind of legal document that says we will cover the default if this issuer can't make good on it. But it's not an actual outlay of any actual cash from the foundation until there's a call on that guarantee. So it's an obligation on their balance sheet, but not actually cash out the door. And they are willing to do that because that's a way that they can leverage their balance sheet to some kind of program, as you said, program related investment, program related objective. And is that a tried and true method? What do they get called? I mean, are folks really at risk? What's the reality there of making that kind of program related investment?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it in terms of like a model of how this can look. We're learning through our program that there are multiple ways to think about this, including some where governments say, and each government is represented by their own financial advisor. As we're doing this within SEC rules, in saying, well, what's the best use of this, and could it stretch to something different? And there. So I would say it's not monolithic. And we really are encouraging it, particularly within each transaction structure that exists within the program, homegrown by the participants who are issuers, to say, but how does this work like a puzzle to really meet what you need? But at a basic level, it should be a way that the credit enhancement from a foundation can actually encourage capital efficiency that can then be passed down to those smaller communities and widen their pool of capital. And I will add that our program is supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They are the social investor that we are testing this with. And certainly, the views we present are our own, but that is the theory that we're holding of, could this correct for a market failure amidst other strategies and corollary with it?
Right. So it's not hypothetical. There's an actual
Not hypothetical, yes.
And then just to your last point, and very briefly, the other part I think is very important is the capacity or the ability of the communities to both put together these possibly complex financing deals and then, as you say, make use of the proceeds in a good and equitable and efficient way. And so you're working with them on sort of building up capacity in their own institutions. Is that right?
There's that. And then there's also kind of this larger question of saying, well, what did this do for in this moment, right? Because you create a moment, ideally, if this works, of capital expansion and of resource expansion that flows down, that stays within this higher level entity. And what we're also aspirationally looking at is, could this also be a moment of narrative shift and practice shift where you actually say, well, wait a minute, I widened my strategy to include a philanthropic funder in a totally different way. Am I thinking strategically about, obviously, and we know this market is in trouble, CDFIs? Am I thinking strategically about every arrow in my quiver of public finance so that when I'm talking to an investor in the future, either as a state entity or these localities who are coming through this process, that they are thinking differently about what a term that's been in impact investing for a long time, which is integrated capitals, can mean, which is that often money that lives in silos, money from public finance, money from bond markets, money from CDFIs, money from philanthropists, is considered in a unified spectrum, and not just we think about that term as it rightly exists at the fund level, but fund with debt, equity, and grant and other characteristics, but really holistically, like at the level of a market. Because I think no one approach to Arthur's question in the chat, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is a solution and a silver bullet. There's almost like a practice change towards a different vision for how capital could be wedded, but that also has to come with, and this is where the education piece fits in, the recognition that it's really hard to do that. And particularly because there are real constraints at the local level and different capital sources start blending, particularly for those smaller places.
Great. Well, I think everybody can see why Lourdes has been such a great partner and source on all this of knowledge. So stick around, Lourdes, and help us just put all the pieces together. But let's jump to Michael, who is one of these state level entities that's helping distribute financing capacity across the state of Vermont. So, Michael, tell us first what a bond bank is, so that we just get some basic terms out there.
David, you pretty much asked me my favorite question. I kind of have drank the special sauce on bond banks and a real advocate for them. But what a bond bank does is pool loans together and historically use the municipal bond market to access really efficient and long-term capital for those what are typically smaller underlying borrowers, and pool loans together that are then assigned to sort of a trust indenture that serve as security for the bonds that we issue. In the sort of like tier one bond banks also benefit from what's called a state intercept. This is where if for some reason, it's never happened in our history, but if for some reason a borrower would not pay us, the dollars due to them from the state can be intercepted to backfill debt service. It's an extremely powerful form of credit enhancement. It exists in over 30 states for school facilities. But what is unique in bond banks is that they can also oftentimes apply that state intercept to all types of governmental units at the local level as well. And so, just kind of building off a little bit of the conversation with Lourdes, and sort of the purpose of this seminar is that despite what you see behind me, our median-sized community in Vermont is 1,800 people, and they all have about 1.5 FTEs or so. But they have needs that are the same as other larger cities around the country. And for that reason, in this year, when we have record municipal bond issuance, we also had record municipal bond issuance. And that's what that speaks to is we've got the same infrastructure, a lot of the same infrastructure needs as you have nationally, and a lot of the same cost pressures. So how do you get to the market in a more efficient way that provides equitable access for everybody and sort of levels the playing field? And a state bond bank is, in my view, the most effective way to do that. So that's what a bond bank is, and a little bit of the insight into why they're so important.
Michael, can you give us an example? You've had a number of it looks like use cases up in Vermont in response to various disasters. How does some of this look in practice?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the more compelling things that we're working on in actually coordination with Lourdes and her team, who've been so great to work with, is moving into recovery and resilience. It's no shock to hear that Vermont is very susceptible to flooding. We have a lot of the same preconditions as a lot of Appalachia, with towns developed in the base of valleys along rivers, which looks like North Carolina and West Virginia and other places. And so what we did following 23 and 24 flooding was use our knowledge of how to standardize documentations, do the hard work of identifying a capitalization source at the fund level, at the bond bank level, and then making bite-size, really easily accessible loans for recovery to our municipalities. And of course we're vested in that because we have exposure all over the state through our traditional loan program. So we're quite interested in making sure that all of those communities are able to pay their bills on time, pay our debt service, have their communities recovery, those economies recovery. And that's where public finance is so unique in so many ways. It's like we're really dealing with the basic building blocks of economic life, of civic life across the country. And that's why I think we deserve a little bit of a special consideration. But in the flood example, we initially developed a program with the state treasurer and state of Vermont, where we took on a loan where they can loan some from cash balances and then use those loans to make recovery loans to communities. And so now what we're thinking about is, okay, this risk isn't going away. We know that this need will be there for the foreseeable future, if not perpetually. So how do we sort of take that recovery program, enhance it by sort of filling some of the gaps that may be there if federal retrenchment occurs, but also be more proactive with our low-cost financing sources to build the resilience model before the event occurs. We reduce our risk in our portfolio, but we also are there in case things slip through the cracks that cannot fully be mitigated with recovery lending as well. And that's where we're working with Lourdes. We're talking to I don't think I'm allowed to say this, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And what is important in that moment, and looks a little bit different, is that the folks that walk through our door in a recovery scenario have a little bit different credit quality than our typical borrower. I'd say some of them are the same. They're folks we see all the same time. But some of them look different. Maybe they haven't had a third-party financial audit before. They have,
And these are cities and
towns and
agencies.
cities. Again, the
Towns and
median
cities.
size place is 1,800 people. So yes, there's a city of 2,000 people, but for the most part, they're towns. And so you've got your 1.5 FTEs and volunteer committees that are trying to deal with recovery. We have one example, Linden, Vermont, that has $18 million in damage from the 24 floods. That is 6 times their annual highway budget. So that's the type of disproportionate scale of impact we're dealing with, and we're trying to find solutions to. And Vermont's hardly unique in this. This is throughout Appalachia again. And so,
Well,
that's very compelling. We're glad we're there for them.
It is. Let me just pause for a second because you said something that, in addition to the record issuances sort of nationwide, it's also record issuances in Vermont. Now, is that
That's
a
right.
good thing in the sense that folks are tapping municipal markets, or are folks just getting themselves deeper in debt and there's a kind of, I don't know, risk shift? You talked about federal retrenchment. Is there a sort of, indebtedness on the local level?
Yeah, I mean, big picture, when we talk to the rating agencies, when we go to market, all the same trends we're seeing, they're seeing as well. It's quite interesting. Our fund balances are up in the post-ARPA era. Same thing nationally. So what's really driving the volume right now is cost escalation. Our median size loan has gone from about $1 million to $3 million in the course of 3 years. And there was some lull in activity as folks work through what to do with the post-COVID era funds, and we're trying to get trying to get a handle on construction contracts, and that's the same. Where bond banks, where potentially philanthropic capital becomes so important is that in rural and small places, yes, you could probably clear the transaction in the capital markets. I think for the most part, with tax support, we're not talking about access to capital. We're just talking about the efficiency of that capital. And why this matters is because these, again, are the building blocks of civic and economic life across America. So we owe it to ourselves to develop the most efficient structure. As examples of that, we've done, some initial research at just looking descriptive statistics of primary issuances with the help from some colleagues. And our up until this year, our median size deal has been about $1 million. Well, that individual, we serialize maturities in the muni world, and that means that each size, each maturity you're selling is only a couple $100,000. The muni market, as folks on this call will tell you, likes big deals. They like New York City. They like California, and those have the most liquidity. So number one, you're looking at huge liquidity premiums. You're looking at high transaction costs for small deals. You're looking at advisors who really need to make it worth their time to spend the time with you, and they have relatively fixed costs. So again, driving more transaction costs. And so that's a very inefficient structure if they choose to do that brain damage in the first place. One of our favorite borrowers used to be up in northern New York and used to go, relatively small community, but, used to talk to the rating agencies, go down to Wall Street, this type of things. And he's our best customer because he says, I love you guys. I don't have to deal with any of that. It's simple. I can focus. I got a million other things I got to do with a small staff, and I can just focus on what matters, which is getting this capital project done. So that's sort of how I think this all kind of ties together. But the rate impact of liquidity and fixed transaction costs is significant and can be in excess of 1% for smaller deals, if not quite a bit more. And oftentimes communities are just saying, this isn't worth my time. If there's a huge opportunity cost for it, I'm going to move on to the next thing. And then what you find out is that infrastructure has tons of deferred maintenance on it, and that becomes a real problem.
Great. I want to get back to the sort of integrated capitals and the way that different, sort of stacks might solve problems. But let's actually bring in Damon as well, and then you're both issuers, and you can maybe talk with each other too about what the innovative structures are. So hi, Damon. And when we last had you on, you were telling us about Finance New Orleans, sort of evolution, but it was in the late great days of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and green banking, and it was going to supply a lot of needed capital for community projects. Some of that's gone away. Where does that leave an issuer like Finance New Orleans?
Well, it certainly made things a little more difficult, but believe it or not, we were able to squeeze some dollars out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund before it completely closed up. So we were able to pull out some low-cost loan and some grant dollars, which are really helping us right now launch our new programming. Just to give everybody a recap that hasn't heard my spiel about Finance New Orleans, we are the City of New Orleans' finance agency. And we were originally created in 1978 as a housing finance agency. So for the first 3 decades of our existence, we were hyper-focused on mortgage financing. I heard Lourdes talk earlier about what public finance does for communities, and that's exactly what we do. We create access to capital or provide capital where private markets may not be investing, where they may not be prioritizing. So we're a quasi-governmental organization that has broad financing powers to bring capital to our community. Well, we did that well until Katrina. Katrina happened in 2005, and at that point, we had a $400 million asset base, which was primarily concentrated in single-family mortgages. We did a little bit of multifamily and some economic development projects, but we were primarily focused on getting people into their first home. And the community knew us for that. They were grateful for the organization for doing that work, but Katrina changed everything. Our $400 million balance sheet evaporated overnight, or drowned, if you will, by 90%. So we've been on a mission to figure out a new direction, really ever since Katrina 20 years ago. I joined the agency 10 years ago as the leader, and my initial charge from the board was to figure out a new direction and to take full advantage of all of the public financing powers that Finance New Orleans has. I mentioned that we were focused on single family. We still have a single family practice or indenture, if you will, to be more technical, but we also added a multifamily indenture and an infrastructure indenture to address some of the community infrastructure needs that we have. So I'll go through each one of them real quickly. On the single family side, we're providing mortgage financing for first-time home buyers, low to moderate income families. And we're doing it via what we call a green mortgage or some version of a rehab mortgage. Essentially, all of the homes in New Orleans need to be resilient, regardless of income category. So our mortgage financing helps those families not only get into the home, but it also provides budgets, small and large budgets, to help them make the homes resilient. Because that was one of the first lessons we learned during Katrina. Our housing stock just wasn't resilient enough to deal with the damage that the storm caused. On the multifamily side, we are providing bond financing and tax abatements for qualified multifamily developers. That's actually been our most active area since we relaunched our programming about 5 years ago. We've supported 17 multifamily projects in the New Orleans area, and we're getting ready to start doing projects in the more regional expanse, so beyond Orleans Parish. That program is good. It ebbs and flows with single family, but there is some quality multifamily development happening in New Orleans right now, and we're also looking at doing more mixed income projects and leveraging our taxable bond capabilities for mixed income projects, along with some trust fund dollars that the city of New Orleans recently created. And our newest arm is the infrastructure work that we're doing. And community infrastructure looks like many different asset types, but we're starting with community solar, microgrids. There's some water management projects in the different communities. We even have some manufacturing opportunities. But we actually have a couple of community solar projects that we're preparing to provide bond financing as well as tax abatements for in 2026. So
You were calling yourself a green bank or becoming a green bank. Are you a green bank?
well,
I guess effectively.
yeah, effectively, we're part of the Green Bank Network. We're part of the Coalition for Green Capital, or the American Association of Green Banks, and we've been a part of those groups for several years now. We actually call ourselves a public investment bank because there's so much work that we do, from housing, single family, multifamily, and infrastructure. At the end of the day, it's about community capital. And I do think the municipal bond market is one of the original impact market. But at the same time, there's a lot of uh, uh, there's a lot of issues with the municipal bond market in terms of the discrimination of where capital goes. And that's always been a problem. So while it is a tool for impact, there are a lot of problems that need to be fixed. And that's what the panel has been talking about as it relates to credit enhancement and making sure that capital is available to certain communities that may be able to pay for their projects, but the project may be too small, or it's a city that just can't attract enough investors or enough attention. And it's hard to really get those projects off the ground. So we've experienced that in New Orleans, trying to raise capital. And we've been working with several foundations, Robert Wood Johnson, the Kresge Foundation, the Hive Fund, to provide us with some of that early philanthropic capital, which you really need. You need philanthropic capital and some public equity, if you will, public capital, in order to make a bond program successful. So we're beginning all of our bond programs from scratch, and having these new innovative ways, or even the GGRF dollars, to help us get the programs moving is the approach that we've been taking in recent years.
Damon, just double click on that a bit. Can you give a specific example of how some of those credit enhancement tools would work in practice, or ones that you've actually used?
Sure. Well, we have tried several things at this point, but let me back up and say that there are existing forms of credit enhancement in the municipal bond market that allow agencies like ours to be pretty consistent. Historically, we've leveraged FHA and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Those are all forms of credit enhancement for single family and even multifamily. But even on the multifamily side, there are high hurdles that have to be climbed in order to get access to FHA credit enhancement, and even some of the other GSE credit enhancements as well. So while they are powerful, they tend to fall short and don't cover enough of the market. And then on the infrastructure side, that space is evolving, and it's so new when we start talking about green or resilient infrastructure, where the project types just simply haven't been done before. And I think it's going to take different players in the market, investors, commercial banks, credit enhancers, philanthropic organizations, to take a few chances on projects. I'll give you an example of one. We are preparing to issue bonds for a couple of community solar projects in New Orleans next year, as I mentioned earlier. And those community solar projects are fairly bite-sized, if you will. They're about $10 million a piece. And they are directly empowered by our local utility, Entergy New Orleans. And so essentially, Entergy New Orleans is allowing 55 megawatts of community solar, which is going to be distributed by private developers. However, they're going to need public financing to make those projects work. Entergy is the only Fortune 500 company we have in New Orleans, and essentially they are managing the program and providing what is in effect a guarantee for the program. So what our municipal advisor is telling us is that we'll be able to sell bonds based on the credit worthiness of the program, which is supported by Entergy New Orleans, but that may not be enough. And that may not give us the rates that we necessarily want. So in that case, it'd be great if Arrival with Johnson could step in and stand behind the transaction where we finance New Orleans has equity on the table. We can use some of our reserve dollars or our GGRF dollars to support the liquidity of the bond issue, and then having additional liquidity from Arrival with Johnson, which has a AAA balance sheet, could further drive down the rates. And that is important because the community solar is being distributed to families in New Orleans that oftentimes have difficulty keeping up with their utility bills. And we get calls in our office because we ran a utility program post-COVID. And I just heard a call the other day. Somebody's calling for utility assistance. We have an old housing stock. We have a lot of historic homes. They're beautiful, but they cost a lot of money to operate. So these community solar projects and these microgrid projects that we are deploying with our bond financing, with our tax abatements, with our ability to do renewable energy tax credits, all of those are going toward helping to lower costs for families so that it can improve their quality of life. So it's really critical that we get the best cost of money from the municipal bond market. And that's where those guarantees can come in and help lower the cost of financing for us.
Terrific. So I think we're now getting a picture, and again, we've teed up sort of what the role of impact investors, philanthropic investors, other investors might be alongside to complement the public financing and to make it work better. And so hold that thought. And then Eric, I think that's kind of your specialty, is figuring out how to bring this together. So maybe you can help us think sort of what this integrated capital stack might look like, and how impact investors might actually play a useful role here.
Yeah, thanks.
So, yeah.
Thanks for that, David. I appreciate that. And again, it's a pleasure to be here and speak with all of you. So yeah, Clarion Call Capital, just for those people who don't know, impact investing platform, specifically in fixed income and specifically in the municipal world. And our goal is to make investments to reduce disparity in the built environment between those that have and those that have not. And we've participated in the traditional market for quite some time. But what I think is kind of interesting, and what you're sort of this sort of convening is getting to, is a new paradigm. And so what we are trying to do with a lot of our partners is to effectively create a direct lending facility for communities within communities. So the big question here is, how do we get money? How do we get financing to smaller communities that have been under-resourced and excluded for decades, if not centuries? I think and that's where impact investors and values-aligned investors can really play a very interesting role in catalyzing a new and transformational way of community investment. And so what we are trying to stand up is a process by which the community itself is at the head of the table, basically dictating and coming up with the menu of projects and we're talking about essential infrastructure here, that essential infrastructure that will bring about, that they come to the conclusion will bring about prosperity and well-being. And then it's up to us, when I say us, collective us, of hopefully values aligned folks and impact investors, to put a capital stack to bring a capital stack to bear to bring that infrastructure to fruition. And if debt is a part of that, then we can actually do that. And what we'd like to do is to actually the key part of this, and this is the differentiation of I think this type of conversation is historically we've all been a part of this traditional capital market issuance, where the banks, there's bond counsel, there's rating agencies, there's municipal advisors. And I personally believe that for smaller communities, those banks and capital market participants have been largely extractive and have exploited those communities. And so, how do we disintermediate? How do we circumvent and bring capital directly to the communities where more of it stays in the community? And so, can we structure deals on the front end with community, driven by the community, and can we structure those and then have values aligned investors and impact investors take those deals down and to support this type of infrastructure financing?
Good. So let's just make this real. We have a little bonus here, which is that Brian Boland in the Delta Fund is actually a client of Clarion Capital in some of these and interested in some of these strategies. So you're actually talking to a values aligned investor, and Brian in the form of Brian, a kind of family office, might have other customers, clients like that. And so how, Brian and Eric, go back and forth with how you sort of think about, and Brian, if you want to introduce yourself, but how you think about this opportunity for values aligned investors to complement this public financing.
Yeah, David, I love how going towards the end, you have so many ideas in your head from these amazing speakers who are bringing up so many salient critical points. It's hard to capture them all. Listen, we got on this journey because we wanted capital to actually do something in the world. And a lot of foundations and investors and people talk about their like public portfolios and their like ESG screens. It doesn't matter if it's screened, that capital doesn't do anything. When you buy a stock, it's been sitting there, you trade on the speculative value, you don't build anything real in the world. But then everyone has this mixed portfolio where they have bonds in their portfolio and they don't think about them. It's just this thing that exists and they're like, yeah, I got bonds. And then they outsource that to somebody who does bonds. And they have like a magic number that they want to put there. But they don't realize, to so many of these comments earlier, that this is truly an impact vehicle, that is actually building real things in the world and building real things in our communities. And so they set these bonds on autopilot, and we did for years too. We just had this autopilot of bonds. And who do you outsource them to? BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, who manages a muni portfolio, who, I guarantee you they are optimizing for highest impact. Okay, sorry, sarcasm, maybe a little too early for that. They're not, they don't care. They're just trying to get these highest rated bonds, and capital all crowds into certain small areas. And so I want the attention of the capital allocators and folks who can actually deploy capital, because Damon was talking earlier about the way that capital flows. And if capital doesn't move to the communities that needs it and just aggregates to New York City and these other areas, we starve vital, patient, low-cost capital from communities that can actually benefit the most from building with this capital. So yes, credit enhancements and those things, that's a market hack. The other thing is that just capital holders, foundations who carry massive bonds on their balance sheet, individuals and family offices who carry bonds in their portfolio can just direct them differently. And if the capital moves differently, the price of that capital changes dramatically. So if we just said, look, not just munis, but like what kinds of munis do we want to be in? And how do we move our capital to those places? You see real transformation in these markets, real transformation in these communities. That's what got us on this journey. And that's why we started to partner with Eric to actually do that, to steer it differently and thoughtfully instead of just like a dumb pipe in our portfolio.
So Eric and Brian, when you hear Lourdes and Michael and Damon talk about how these kind of deals and these transactions can be put together, does that suggest a role for impact investors that you can, yeah, and sort of how would you just frame up that role, Eric, in a how should folks think about
absolutely.
that? What should folks tell their advisors or ask their advisors?
Absolutely. And Damon can attest. Damon and I were together earlier in November, and we were talking about trying to pilot a direct lending to New Orleans at our time in our time together. And so it really isn't just amorphous or just some idea. It really is conversations. No, following Brian and Brian's comments, you know, there's a tail wagging the dog. If investors are really interested and keen, whether it be foundations, high net worth individuals, family offices, multifamily offices, et cetera, like the market is going to respond. And if the, you know, and I think that as more and more money comes into this impact space, and I've said this for years and years and years, David, not only will market participants change their posture, but so will the municipalities themselves, and they will become open to more of these types of financing. And what really creates a catalyst for this type of thinking around for example, a direct lending, is it's going to take a community to think quite a bit differently than they have in the past. It is sort of saying, hey, we've been doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we haven't had much success. In fact, it's, by definition been crazy. Nothing has changed. How do we catalyze a difference and change? And absolutely, that core foundational component can be impact investors, and can be foundations, and can be endowments, et cetera, particularly those who are looking to catalyze, better looking to align their mission with the way in which they invest, and to catalyze new ways and new thought processes and new developments in markets.
David, I mean, think about this. How many of the investors and foundations on this call have had board level meetings about their bond strategy?
Zero.
Probably not a lot, right? There've been a lot of conversation around their ESG strategy around equities, but what have they had discussions around there? Super practical baby steps that every single allocator on this call could take is just ask, what are we doing with our bonds and our bond strategy? And just starting by looking at the existing strategy and allocating it A, towards muni bonds, and B, towards truly impactful muni bonds and muni bond partners, you'd see just a massive shift in what's already happening with stuff that people don't even think about.
Yeah. I could back that up with Brian, what Brian is saying. As a bond manager, most people look at their municipal portfolio really as something that they have to have. There's, generally speaking, when you're talking about individuals, it's tax advantage income, and it's an offset to your equity and alternative asset class volatility, right? But that's where it ends. Here's my duration, here's my credit quality, and that's where it ends. But what's so unique about the municipal market is there's a use of proceeds. And there's a specific community that this is all behind, that this is all centering and uplifting. There's a theory of change. There should be a theory of change around these financings. What is that? And why aren't we uplifting that and prioritizing those specific communities and those specific projects? And that is what impact investing in municipal finance can do.
Great. Well, so Damon, it sounds like you and Eric have been chatting, and you have some ideas of how that capital could fit in. And Michael, I imagine, this gives you some ideas as well. So just from the point of view of an issuer and looking at family offices, foundations, et cetera, what do you need? What's your ask?
Sure. Well, we've had to diversify our sources of capital in modern times. Post-Katrina, post-recession, post-COVID, things have changed substantially for city governments like ours. So we're having to form relationships with alternative forms of capital, which we're just unfamiliar with. So family offices, even philanthropy, we didn't have much familiarity with. So the ask, there are multiple asks right now, but the basic asks are to invest in our projects, buy our bonds. There are direct lending or direct placement opportunities like Eric was talking about. Those are opportunities, but we also have the ability to stand up projects where credit does not exist. And we have several projects like that in our pipeline. So if we could get better understanding around the table from all of the parties, philanthropy, even you still need private capital once you bring philanthropy to the table. So if we could get just a network, and we can start small with a network of practitioners who understand and see the value in building out this market, because there are scale opportunities. We're not the only community in the country that needs capital. We're not the only community on the coast. The other communities right now, as we know, going through climate changes or climate issues. So I think there's an opportunity to form a new type of muni market, and it's going to evolve substantially over the next 5 to 10 years. Things are going to move online.
Amen.
We're going to have different kind of structures and
Amen.
ability to bring new projects to bear. So I think we just need to start with a good think tank and brain trust of people who know what needs to happen.
Michael or Lourdes, what does this all suggest to you in terms of like ways of putting capital together?
And Michael, do you want to go first and then I'll go?
I'll try to keep it brief. I mean, I think first of all, for the audience, if you're interested in the type of impacts munis make in small communities, it's typically between page 16 and 20 of our official statement, which is what the prospectus is called in the muni world. It's up on our website at vtbondbank.org investors. But what I would say, and what I think we have to be careful with this moment, is like everybody has their specific thing that they're super interested in, like green energy or resilience or this or that. One of the things that does work about the muni world is that it's very plastic in that it can meet the needs in the prioritization of that community where they are. And I would just say, like, with this audience, we want to be careful not to lose that. That is what bond banks do really well, is that we meet people where they are. So for example, we had two communities in southern Vermont that worked together, and it sort of was facilitated really nicely through the bond bank to, and there's definitely some, they had all their permits, they had their environmental, but they bought a gravel pit. And I was like looking at the numbers on this thing. I was like, why are you vertically integrating with a gravel pit? Well, it turns out post-flood, when the 80% of your exposure is in your road network, having a gravel pit becomes really helpful to rebuild quickly and get people to work, to school, etc. So you could not design a federal program or an investment strategy that focused on gravel pits, I guarantee you. But for that community, that was what was most impactful. And so I just say that sort of as a word of interjection, like the muni market is really peculiar and weird and decentralized, but it does allow people to do what they need to do without a lot of strings, honestly. Like, they can procure the way that their state requires them to procure. They can hire, they sort of have a lot more flexibility than some of these grant programs that are like really time intensive, really specific, and like you get one project done with a grant program, whereas you can get many projects done in the same time period with the muni market. So that would be sort of the caution I would suggest. But I agree with Damon. Like I really do think now is an interesting time for this space. The biggest banks are consolidating. They're sort of focusing on really big deals. There's a number of people in the industry retiring, so you don't have as many incumbents to sort of get in your way on new structures. And so it is, I agree with Damon, a really, really exciting time in that regard. I think, for states that don't have bond banks, this community is the perfect vehicle to allow the same flexibility and the same low costs.
Good. Lourdes, just before you answer, let me interject one of the questions, which I think will be on point, from David Wood, about the expanded capacity on the public, quasi-public issuer side of things and what that might look like, i.e., is there more to issue, different kinds of tools to work with, specific subsectors or social goals that could be done or can't be done? What would it mean to lean into state and local level issuers as market shapers for social goals in specific places? I think that's kind of the whole ball of wax there.
Sure. I'll answer that first and speak to the broader theme. So, one area is to think about all of the ancillary practices that we haven't talked about that sit specifically within state and local governments, particularly if you think not every local government has a capital plan or the ability to do that with a mind towards investments for different reasons, including a lot of the capacity challenges that Michael has brought up. And he's one of the leaders across America who's cognizant of this and at the state level actually doing something towards that. And if you think about just what does it mean to change that capacity, it means you might actually surface the assets that are fundable and think about how to create a financing plan that is holistic, multi-year, and that you can actually say, hey, this is what we actually need to do. This is how we can prioritize. And how do you bring capital to that like a puzzle? Because without those pieces that often come just from capacity building and then expanded staff and other resources, those are some of the foundational pieces. And there's so many others we could talk about, to David's question. And to the broader point of this conversation, Brian, Eric, and Damon, certainly like the work you're doing is, so aligned in precisely why we wake up in the morning. Even like Brian, as you said, to make sure capital does something in the world. And I want to lift up, as we end this conversation, the investor we haven't talked about. That's the muni market's largest investor, which is the retail investor. Because even though I totally agree with you that foundations and impact investors can really make a different and directive strategy when we think about their fiduciary responsibilities towards their own endowment guidelines, the muni market, at least from a public standpoint, is driven by retail investors. When I was an investment banker, I saw the dynamic and what it can mean to pricing. To have an order book that is well positioned for institutional pricing gives you price discovery and leverage. And that's what we want when we are funding deals that are ultimately paid back with public funds. And I think that when we say, what would that investor need? How do you make sure that every government we're talking about that feels left behind is positioned to go to that table just as they would to a foundation and tell their story? I really believe they should have access to both and not just kind of, one spectrum of capital, but that we need to be cognizant and prepare people to come to the widest table of the market. And I think with everything that we're talking about, it does take a narrative shift, and it considers how can not just having a different path to what Eric is doing, which is creating almost like a different way to think about private placements, also strengthen the way we think about going to market in the public realm.
Great. Because I encourage people to use the Q&A, I want to sort of reward that behavior. So let's just have a couple of quick hits. For Lourdes, what is the size, what is the fee or the return that goes back to a philanthropy for a PRI guarantee? I imagine it depends kind of on the structure.
You can read about those that have been done in the CDFI world on their case studies, and we cannot comment because that is a negotiation between the foundation and the issuer. But I will say the IRS says these are not done for a profit motive. So
as a PRI or a program-related investment, it has to have a charitable purpose, as it's
and it can't be, they're not doing this to make income. They're doing this to further, their foundation objectives.
And then another question from Della is how to build capacity at smaller regional foundations. So it's not just the big national foundations, but is there work, other folks can use guarantees and other tools. And then another one from Della, well, this may be a Michael question. Are bond banks chartered at the state level or independent of state government? Or I imagine, again, there's a variety. But
quickly,
yeah.
we are an instrumentality of the state with an independently appointed board from the governor, but they operate independently, which you kind of want to have pretty clean credit discussions without a lot of political influence. And so that's a pretty common structure. There are examples of bond banks at lower levels, and certainly at the county level, like in New Jersey, but those tend to look a little bit different.
And then here's an interesting one from Eric Foster, and it has to do something we were talking about, which is as appropriations from the federal government and other things are cut back. How are you able to help municipalities, counties, and school governments meet immediate operating holes and capital investment clawback? So is there a moment now? A lot of things are in flux with funding where this becomes more important, or to the point, maybe somehow the obligation or the risk has actually been shifted down to folks. And then the final question that's in the queue here, and it's kind of the one we've been talking about, is what's limiting the speed and scale of this integrated capital investment across small communities. So that's kind of the broad thing. And now we're coming right up on the hour. So let's maybe think about all those questions and let's give each of you a chance for a final thought. And I don't know if you, Lord, let's let you finish up. Okay. So let's not start with you, but let's go back. And we'll go Michael, Damon, Eric, Brian, and then Lourdes, you get the last word. So Michael is kind of your sum up if you haven't already said
Sure.
it.
So there's like so many, as Brian said, there's so many things to comment on. I think for this audience and to building off Lourdes's comments is the importance of the individual investor. We're a fairly high tax state, so we see a lot of individual investors in sort of domestic retail investment in our bonds, but it is being somewhat democratized, and I imagine the family offices participate in what we refer to as separately managed accounts, but sort of registered investment advisors. And, those are interesting, and a lot of the retail participation is moving to those as they become smaller and smaller, but that is a vehicle where you can have these same types of conversations. I mean, I think my concern is that those are sort of being homogenized in their management, and they just become rate in duration interested rather than specific projects, but it is a potential opportunity if you have a dialogue with your investment advisors. So I'd say that. And then on the federal side, I think that's a really relevant question. We're just too early. Certainly, we can step in on capital projects. What's most heartbreaking to us is the BRIC program for resiliency that has been canceled and maybe is back again. We're not sure, but that's certainly an area where the bond market can step in and finance resilience projects. Can probably do so at a lower cost to purchase the construction because it doesn't have all this sort of like things you need to do, but it's not grant. And so that is a burden. You have to have some prioritization around that. But yeah, I think we'll see more of that over time. But we're not in a place where, operating budgets are really dependent on federal funds for the most part. And I think we probably want to stay away from that. But for capital projects, absolutely. So yeah, thanks again.
Great. Plenty more to follow up. Damon, some thoughts?
Something we've done in New Orleans, as a matter of fact, right as the current administration was getting elected into office, our citizens voted on a housing trust fund, which is going to take 2% of the city's annual budget and shift it to a housing trust fund starting in 2026. Finance New Orleans is one of the co-managers of that fund, and it's an example of the reinvestment that's going to have to happen at the local level in order for us to get many of these projects off the ground, which are 5 million, 10 million, 20 million in size. Not a big amount for the capital markets, but huge impact when you're on the ground. When you can see $10 million in the community that normally doesn't get it, you can feel it, you can see it, and it makes a difference. So my message there is I think communities need to figure out ways with limited resources to reinvest and then partner up with philanthropy and private capital that can match and leverage those dollars.
Great, great. Eric, that's a perfect tee up for you.
Yeah, I think so. I would just say really quickly, the municipal market, and obviously I'm self-interested in this, so take this with a grain of salt. But the municipal market is, when it comes to proximity to impact at scale, no other market like it. Period.
Amen.
That's it. Drop mic. Drop the mic. Okay. Brian.
Yeah, look, this is simple. I'll build on that. Know what you own and then being intentional about how you deploy what you own. This is incredibly simple as a no regrets, easy step. Is to look at your munis and then demand that your financial advisor actually allocates them differently and intentionally and explores these opportunities around impact. It is that simple to do a no regrets step to take what you're doing today and actually shift it towards something that actually matters.
Great, great. And Lourdes, just send us off
Yeah.
with
Gosh, with the pressure over the last 30 seconds, I think that to do what we've all been talking about, which is how does money make a difference in the world in markets that don't often innovate, I really believe that we need to think about integrated capitals differently, that the silos that exist from community development, CDFI funds, philanthropic dollars, social investments, public finance, and the way that allocators think about their role across that non-monolithic spectrum needs to be different. I think it begins with awareness and really getting into the weeds of understanding, well, what does it take for a government to raise money? What does it mean to resource community? And to also layer into that a strategy of change in place.
Awesome. And place, I think, is really important. And I think following the cohort that you're pulling together and the examples of the transactions that you're helping design is going to be super interesting in the year to come. And as we said, there is some reality to this, and some investors that are trying to experiment with what levers to pull, really. So that'll be great. We'll welcome you all back to report in on that. Thank you, Dennis, and the whole Impact Alpha team. Thank you to all the speakers here, and also thanks to all you agents of impact. And we'll see you next year. So happy holidays and happy New Year to everybody, and until we meet again.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays. Thank you.
Right.